More than 1,000 years ago, a local king and his kin lived at Lake Tissø. Join us on this journey back in time and visit his royal residence at the Lake of Tyr. In the Viking Age, Tissø was an island, and shielded by it was the harbour. On the brink of Helleby Å was the trade and workshop area, and on the west brink of Tissø was the royal residence. The great merchant ships sailed the harbour. They carried goods from both England, Ireland, Germany, Russia and the Mediterranean countries. The many rich finds show us this. In the harbour, the goods were loaded onto smaller ships so they could sail up Helleby Å. The river was wider then and held more water, and the journey, the 7 kilometers from the coast of the Great Belt to the royal residence, would not have been long. The water in Tissø was also higher then. The royal residence was therefore on a small island, surrounded by wet moors and the waters from the lake and the river. Strategically well placed, easy to defend and easy to reach over the water. On the banks of Helleby Å, you found the workshops and the merchants' square. It would be lively and noisy, with the smith and the bronze caster doing their jobs. The comb maker, the wood carver and the bead maker were eagerly producing their goods, and textiles, both for everyday garments and the woolen sails for the ships, changed hands here. In the workshops, magnificent weapons and jewellery were created for the king and his men, as well as knives, tools and fire steel for the common man. The travelling craftsmen and merchants lived here on the square at Tissø from time to time. They came when the king threw a feast or held a market. Whole families were staying in these pit houses. These small dugout cabins served both as workplace and home. The archaeological plan shows the buildings within the palisade, on the royal residence around 900. Let us try to recreate the square in all its glamour. First, the King's Hall itself. Almost 50 meters long, it is one of the largest known Viking halls in Denmark. In the western end, the king and his family lived, and in the eastern end, he held his feasts. The dwellings next to the hall were probably home to the hird, the king's guardsmen, or some of the people closest to the king. These 4 buildings can have been used as stables, storage or pantries. We will get back to the small fenced cult house. This was how the Viking world at Tissø looked over 1,000 years ago. The small fenced cult house is something very special. The figures shown here are from the Norse mythology and are found in the area. We meet both the Valkyries, Freya, and the goats of Thor. In the cult house, sacrifices were made to the gods. But how was it done back then? The Icelandic storyteller Snorri Sturluson describes in the saga of Håkon the Good how smaller animals were killed in the sacrificial celebrations, the cult feasts, around 1,000 years ago. Their blood was then used to dye the court pillars and walls red for the feast. In the cult house, we meet 2 wooden gods. They have been sprinkled with blood from the sacrificial animals, and food has been put out for them. Written sources tell us that sacred objects could be kept in the cult houses. So maybe the Ring of Tissø once had its place here? If you arrived as a guest to the king's house, you were led along the path through the big gate. The strong palisade around the estate secured the area against uninvited guests. In the square, the horses were stabled. Horses were expensive and not for everybody. Bridles, spurs and metal studs and plates from harnesses show us that they were used for riding. Perhaps they were the horses of the hird, the armed guard of the king. Even before you'd enter the king's hall, the fire smoke and the smell of roasting wild boar would greet you. The warmth of the many people gathered for the feast would fill the eastern end of the hall. In here there was chatter and mead, and an abundance of food was served at the long tables. The bards and storytellers, called skjell, entertained with music and stories. Here you see the lyre player with a string instrument. The tiny tuning screw is an actual find made near the hall, a beautiful memento of the music that sounded at the feasts. The hall stood not alone in the square. Besides the cult house and the smithy, there were 4 smaller buildings. Perhaps they were used for storing food. The farms in the neighbouring Sæby and Bakkendrup could have grown crops like grains, linen, hemp, peas and field beans. Let us step inside and visit the ones closest to the king. They lived in the nearby longhouse. The fire under the pot at the fireplace would have been lit from morning till night. Perhaps fish soup could be on the dinner menu. The closed sleeping chamber with the large bed would have been quite calm. So this is how the royal residence at Tissø looked around the year 900. A centre of power where the Norse religion, trade and craftsmanship held a very high status. A place in Denmark which for more than 500 years was central to the contact with Europe. From the edge of the lake, men and women have been watching weapons being thrown into the lake of Tyr. Once a sacrifice to the gods. Today, a memento of the Vikings and their beliefs, their magnificent craftsmanship and their world at Tissø.